Hello and welcome. Sometimes when I'm practicing, I get a call and a potential client goes, could you send us a quote for your services? Would like to do a new house, or would like to do an addition or an extension, or would like to do an internal refurbishment. So I send them my quote, and then they come back and say, hey, thank you very much for your quote, but do you think we're gonna need an engineer on this project? Do you think council is gonna ask for geotech report, or do you think, basically asking, what other consultants do you think or reports we are gonna need to get before we can lodge this project, before we can begin on this project and lodge it into council? And so I spend the next couple of minutes or, half an hour, whatever, thinking through the number of consultants that the project is going to require. And so, and sometimes if the client doesn't ask and they ask me for a quote, I list down, I look at the project, and then I give my quote, but then I list down other consultants that I think we may require down the line. And so when the client looks at that list, they go, oh, wow, this is quite something. And so from then on, they begin to realize, oh, maybe we are taking on more than we can chew or whatever. So, as I said in the introduction video on this channel is a channel that aims to deliver or to give you free design and construction tips that might actually help you save some dollars. So in this video, I am going to share with you a comprehensive list of consultants that you may require in any project, starting from a new build, whether you're doing a new build, whether you're doing an extension, whether you're doing an addition or a renovation project. I've taken the liberty to develop a spreadsheet of all the consultants that at any one point in my practice so far, I've had the privilege of working with on different projects. And I'm going to go through each consultant and explain their role and why they are needed in that particular project. And then I'm going to touch a bit on council compliance, some of the things that you need to bear in mind when you are lodging with council. And at the end of it, you will begin to appreciate why construction in New Zealand is sometimes very expensive. And this mainly centers around compliance, what we need to do to comply with the building code and all the requirements that come with the building code and the resource consent, and etc., etc. So in New Zealand, construction can be expensive because of compliance issues and all the things that we have to do in order to comply with the building code and other things especially the Resource Management Act. So I'm going to turn around my camera and we're going to go through this spreadsheet, and I'll take you the process of the consultants that you need or you might need on any project. In some projects, depending on the complexity of it, you might not need all of these consultants. In certain projects, if they're big projects, you may need all of them. So it depends on the size of the project. So the number of consultants you need on any project will depend on the size of that project and the complexity of that project. A small project could be a small project, but it's quite complex. So you might need more than 3 or 4 consultants just to make it compliant and make it work. Some projects could be a big project, but it's very straightforward. And also they say where you're building, where your section is. If your section is, say, maybe on a steep slope, or it's in a flooding zone, you're going to require a different set of consultants. So let's have a look at this, and then I will go through each. Right. So we have taken the liberty in my practice to come up with this list of consultants that one might actually need, and I hope this is clear. Normally I don't want to do cut and paste because it's a bit tedious and takes time, and I only have like 30 minutes to do this. Actually less than 30 minutes. So number one, if you're thinking of building or you're starting on any project, you're gonna need an architect or a designer. This is a professional that will translate your dreams into reality. So everything is, in any construction or design project, everything is kickstarts off by an architect or designer. So find one, and that will be your lead consultant, and that is the person or the consultant that is going to lead you through making sure that your project is realized. And then the second person you're going to need is an urban planner. Why an urban planner? An urban planner, these are professionals familiar with the district plan rules and standards that you need to comply with in order to be able to lodge your or to get your resource consent through council. So you might need, and why you need an urban planner is that if your proposed development is not compliant with any one of the standards in the district plan or the zone in which you're building, then you're going to need a resource consent, and an urban planner can help you to prepare a robust resource consent for council. When you talk to council will always advise you the same thing, that talk to an urban planner or a qualified professional who is always an urban planner to help you prepare a resource consent. In my practice, we have done resource consent before, so we do most of our resource consents in-house. And then you're going to need a geotech engineer. A geotech engineer or a geotech report, these are people who assess the professional who assess the ground stability of your section, to determine whether the sort of foundation you're going to require. So nowadays, almost always, whether you're doing whether it's a small building or a small project or an extension or addition, you're most likely going to need a geotech engineer, and council will always ask for a geotech report. So before you start, if you're thinking of starting a project, you will think about a geotech report, which now is done by a geotech engineer. And then obviously you're gonna need, and before I go to the truss design bit, in cases where you do not need a geotech engineer, where you assume that you're building a good ground, there are some cases you can assume that you're building on good ground, and therefore you will use the foundation as designed in the NZS 3604 standards. There's a way to determine what is referred as good ground, and this is found in the standards. So talk to your designer or engineer or consultant or lead consultant to determine if your section is good ground using the NZS 3604. But like I said, nowadays almost always your council will ask for a geotech report, and therefore you're going to require a geotech engineer. Truss design, again, if you're going to build using trusses, you will need a truss design. These are specialist truss designers, where your designer or architect will just give them the plans or the roof plan of your proposal, and then they would generate trusses for you. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to use your truss designs. You need to use trusses. You can use rafters, and you can size up rafters using, again, the standard NZS 3604. Quantity surveyor, you may or may not need a quantity surveyor. This is a call you have to make as a developer or as a client, because a quantity surveyor will give you the cost estimate of your project. Sometimes I've seen other clients just take the complete drawings, the detailed drawings, and then they give to a builder to cost directly. But most of the time, some builders don't have the necessary skills to cost the project, so the builder will then take those drawings and give them to a quantity surveyor to do the costing. Another consultant you're going to need is a structural engineer. Now, a structural engineer will come in and is the one who designs the structure of your building according to code, and to make sure that the structure is robust. And also the structure, so this refers to your foundations. They will deal with your foundations. They will deal with the bracing, the wall structure, and all the beams, all the columns, if it's going to be involved columns, etc., etc. Now, if the geotech engineer recommends that your foundations need to be specifically designed, then you're definitely going to need a structural engineer to design those, a qualified structural engineer to design those foundations, and also do your bracing. Although sometimes bracing, if it's for a small building or a straightforward building, we can always do, your designer can do the bracing straight out of 3604. Or even use what we call a jib. Jib have a bracing calculator that you will need to use, that you can use. Now, so up to that point, I'm gonna just say something up to this point, that those first four consultants are normally your standard consultant that you will generally need on a small project. You need a designer or you might need an urban planner, although sometimes your designer should be familiar with the codes and the standards, or the zoning standards of the zone that they're designing to. And then you need your truss designer and your structural engineer. So on a small project, most of the time, if it's a simple bungalow or a simple two-story house, etc., you will need more or less those three consultants: architect or designer, maybe urban planner, geotech engineer, truss designer, and structural engineer. And to some extent, you will need a surveyor, and the surveyor basically is just to map out where the beacons are of the section, so that you know where where your boundaries, the extent of your boundaries, and that you're building within those boundaries. Now, assuming you're doing multiple dwellings, this is where now it starts to get complex. If you're doing multiple dwellings, it begins to get complex, because then you're going to be needing more consultants. We start with, council will always ask you for an infrastructure report. So and then you're going to need a civil engineer to start to provide an infrastructure report. An infrastructure report is a report that just shows council that that the proposal that you're doing, say you want to do 3 townhouses or 4 townhouses or 5, 6, 7 townhouses, multi-unit construction. So an infrastructure report will tell council that the infrastructure available on site either is adequate or it needs upgrading, right? So you need somebody, a civil engineer or an infrastructure engineer, to come out and do a study and then recommend what improvements needs to be done on that particular site to take on to extra on the infrastructure, to take on to the extra dwellings that you're going to put in place. And then you're going to need a traffic engineering report, because you're building multi-units. You're going to need a traffic engineering report because you're bringing in more traffic. Remember, if the section was having 1 unit, now you're bringing in 2, 3, 4, 5 more units. You're going to need a traffic assessment done, and that becomes that is referred to as a traffic engineering report, or an engineering planning assessment or whatever. Then, of course, surveyor. I've talked briefly about a surveyor. You're going to need a surveyor to give you the points, the levels. If you have a sloping site, even if you have a flat site, you'll need a surveyor to sort of give you some points, some levels of building. If you have a sloping site, you need a surveyor to map out those points. And then an acoustic report. You will need an acoustic engineer to come out and do an acoustic report, because you're having multiple units which are sharing walls. So you're sharing what we call intertenancy walls. An acoustic report will study and recommend the materials that you're going to use so that those intertenancy walls are acoustically sound and robust, and that there's no noise traveling between units and between floors if you're doing apartments. And then a fire consultant. You will need a fire consultant, again, if you're doing multiple units, because of course you're using intertenancy walls. And so a fire engineer or a fire consultant will tell you or will recommend to you the best way to do your fire design to prevent fire spread between the units and between floors if it's an apartment. In some instances, like I said, if you're building in a flood-prone area or a section that has been determined to be in a flood zone, you're definitely going to need a flood engineer. Okay, so a flood engineer will come in and do a flood report, and that report will again recommend how far above the flood level, based on the code, should you lift your units to be. So how far from the flood level? Say if the flood level is about 29.6 meters above sea level, then the minimum, I think from memory, you're required to have your floor level is 500. So your floor level should be about 30.1, but you need a flood engineer to actually give you the correct offset of the existing flood level, and they do their flood calculations and all the other things, and then they come up with some levels for you to work with as a designer. And then if you're building, then you might need an ecological report if you're building in a riparian area. So a riparian area is you're building within, say, 10 meters of a stream, you're building within 30 meters of a lake, you're building within, 30 meters on the coastal line or whatever. But if you're building, generally, if you're building within a riparian area, you may be required to do an ecological report. So, as a matter of fact, we have a project at the moment that we were required to do. A flood report, because we are building in a flood zone, and then we're also required to do a very comprehensive ecological report because you're building within a riparian area. So we did all those reports, and of course many others and some others as well. So up to that level, you can see with the complexity and size of a project and where you're building the project, you're going to need different types of consultants to come together to make sure that your project is complying, is designed robustly, and is designed according to code, and there's not going to be issues when in fact it's the construction begins. Now, with all these consultants, let me see how many. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. assuming, you're building 10 units, for instance, in a riparian area and in a flood zone, that is the project that I would say will require all these 13 consultants to come on board. And at the end of the day, you probably will need to appoint a project manager to manage all of them. So you can see from what I've explained and what I've listed, why, just how much money you're going to spend on consulting when you're building in New Zealand. Now, I can't give you any figures because each consultant, normally they give their own quotes. So I never tell a client that, a traffic engineer is going to cost this much or a structural engineer is going to cost this much. No, what you do as a client, you identify these consultants and you ask them to come on board and give you their quotes of what their services are going to cost. But imagine, just from the word go, you're going to start paying about 13 consultants to make sure that the project that you want to do is robust and sound. Now, it doesn't stop there. Further down, I have what I call counsel and compliance. Now, when you are doing all this due diligence and during the consenting process, remember at this point we haven't even put a shovel in the ground. We haven't even started anything to do with construction. We are still just at the planning stage. We're trying to figure out who are we going to need on board for this particular project. So when it comes to counsel, it's always advisable to have what we call a pre-application meeting. If you know now that you probably may have determined from your urban planner or designer that you're going to need a resource consent. So council always advises to have a pre-application meeting, okay? And the application meeting just takes you through your proposal and the things that council will be looking for when in fact you submit your resource consent for approval, etc., etc. So it sort of highlights some of the key things that council will want to be looking at before you go any further. And then, of course, once all that is done, there's also the resource consent application fee. So if you're needing a resource consent, then you're going to have to lodge a resource consent application, and there's fees involved. Then if you're doing multiple units, there's what we call the subdivision consent application. So you will need to apply for a subdivision consent application, but that application can be submitted together with your resource consent at the same time. Then once you get your resource consent, you need to lodge for your building consent. So now, sometimes if it's a big complex project, you might want to do building consent pre-application meeting again with council. Again, this one is aimed at just guiding you on how you're going to be able to put together a good and complete building consent for your project. And then of course there's the building consent application itself that you lodge. So all these things that I've described come with the fees. And so in my spreadsheet, we've got your consultants. You have your consultants that for any project, and I say for a small project, you might probably just need maybe two or three consultants. Your designer, your geotech, and your structural engineer. Sometimes a designer has a bit of planning knowledge and they may save you this much. Like I said, in my practice, we do all our planning in-house. So we try as much as possible to save our clients some money on that aspect. And then so you finish with your consultant fees, and then you have council compliant fees. So all these processes. Then let's assume you get your building consent. Now you come down to construction, now the real construction. So you've ticked up the above things, and now you're going to start putting shovels in the ground. There's the construction, which is always done per square meter. And then after your construction or during your construction, you have what I call extras to construction, which are your civil works, fences, paving, minor touches here and there, just to make sure the building, whatever you're proposing, your building is all up to speed and all looking good. And again, these are things to do, also to do with what we call your compliance documents. So, your CCC, certificate code of compliance, inspections, etc., etc. All those things are extras to construction. So basically, in New Zealand, this is what happens in a construction when you start your construction process. If you are proposing to do something, you want to do a new build, you want to do an additional extension, this is the process you have to follow. You have to bear in mind. You will start with your designer, and then you're gonna start. You'll start with your architect or designer. That is the person who will jumpstart the whole project, and then you might need an urban planner, again depending on the size of the project, and if there are some planning aspects your designer is not able to handle, then they will bring in a planner. You're definitely gonna need a geotech engineer because of they have to assess the soil stability or ground stability. You're gonna need your trusses designed. Quantity surveyor is touch and go. Some people do engage a quantity surveyor, others don't. Civil or infrastructure engineer. If you're doing multi-units, you're gonna need those ones. Traffic report, multiple units, we'll need that one. Surveyor, if you're doing subdivision, if eventually you're gonna do a subdivision of your units, you're gonna need a surveyor. Acoustic report, where you're doing multiple dwellings. Acoustic and fire report, where if you're doing multiple units. And then fire consultant, flood engineer. If your section is in a flood zone, you're definitely gonna need a flood engineer. Ecological report or engineer. If you're building within a riparian area or margin, then you're gonna need a qualified ecologist to do an ecological report, ecological mitigation report really, and that will help with your application. So you finish with your consultants, number one, and then you go to number two, you go to council compliance, so all your resource consent applications, all your subdivision applications, all your building consent applications and pre-application meetings. That is the second phase. And you go to this with your consultants. And then, of course, you start your construction. And then there's the extras to construction. So it's a 4-part that I've broken down for anyone who is thinking about starting your construction. It's a 4-part thing that you need to think about. There's the consultants that you have to work with. There's the council compliance, your applications, RCs and BCs, and then there's the construction, and then there's the extras to construction. How you go about this and how this can save you money, again, like I said, it depends on the initial architect or designer and how knowledgeable they are in terms of where can they work with you to cut, to have some savings depending on the complexity and size of your project. So for all my clients who will be watching this video and anyone interested in or thinking about construction, this video is for you. Knowing this process, having this knowledge upfront will help you then plan better for your next building project and decide right from the bat, planning a new house, who am I going to need? Watch this video and it will tell you exactly the kind of consultants and what each one of them does, and you will decide whether you need them or not, right? So thank you again for watching, and please, as always, don't forget to subscribe. We are on the road to 1,000 subscribers, I'm creating a community of people who are legitimately or sincerely interested in learning something out of this channel, and it's my intention to keep educating people and demystifying the construction process, so that we are able to build robust and resilient and sustainable buildings. So that is the aim of this channel. I want to demystify the complexity and mystery surrounding construction by breaking it down in simple language and explaining the process clearly and straightforward, so that people are able to understand what they are getting themselves into when they think about building. Right, so up to that point, it's probably clear now why sometimes constructing in New Zealand can be expensive. Comment down below what the process you follow in constructing in your own home country or city or wherever, and let me know. Guys, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.